That's her.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Board of Adjustments meeting for, it's June 20th, 2018 already. Our first order of business is approval of minutes from December 18th, 2017. We haven't had a meeting for a while.
I'll move approval.
Yeah. I have a motion to approve the minutes. Steve, you're actually the only one there. You willing to second that motion?
Yeah, I'll second.
I have a motion. I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Abstain.
One abstention. It passes with 3 passes, 1 abstention. And now we are on to the main item this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. So before you tonight, we've got a public hearing for a conditional use permit for a large child care facility at 412 North Monroe Street. So the large child care facility, essentially proposal is to relocate St. Rose's existing large child care facility across the street to St. Mary's School. And so we define a large child care facility as being 21 or more children. It's anticipated that 28 preschool and pre-kindergarten, so ages 3 to 4 years old, children are expected to be enrolled upon the initiation of that program at St. Mary's. And 3 to 4 employees depending upon the staff-child ratio. So depending upon the ages of the children, there's a formula that calculates the number of staff that are required per the facility. And St. Mary's operating hours are from 7 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. So a little bit of background on St. Mary's School. In 2005, they originally obtained a conditional use permit to expand the Catholic school, and they also received 4 variances associated with building height, parking, landscape buffers, and front yard setbacks. And then in 2007, they amended that conditional use permit to address changes to the originally approved conditional use permit. And those included different design for the roof structural system, new heating and cooling system to be located in the southeast corner, proposed plan to phase the development of the project. And the amended CUP had additional conditions to design an enclosure for the HVAC system, follow a timeline that allowed for phasing of the building construction, and to review the CUP, so essentially expire after 3 years to look at compliance with the minimization of noise, light, and parking impacts. And 3 years later, in 2010, they ended up receiving a permanent conditional use permit from the board with the condition that the enrollment be capped at 185 students. And currently, St. Mary's enrollment is 77 students and 18 employees, which include the child care facility teachers. So this is the subject property outlined in red, the center of your screen. We've got Monroe Street, which runs north-south here to the west, Lincoln Street to the east, and then to the north is D Street, which is designated as a minor arterial. This was the previous location of St. Rose's and the convent here to the west. This property is primarily surrounded by single-family dwellings, but there are some duplex and multifamily structures intermingled in the adjacent neighborhoods. Taking a look at the zoning configurations, it's in the moderate density residential, which is our R2 zone, so which that allows primarily single-family dwellings. Further to the west, off of Howard Street, is the R3 zone, which is medium density residential, allows duplexes, twin homes, townhouses within that zone. So looking at the comprehensive plan, like I'd mentioned, D Street's a minor arterial, and then Monroe and Lincoln Streets are local neighborhood streets. This property is currently designated as neighborhood conservation, and the comp plan points to neighborhood conservation as intending to preserve the character of many of the city's existing built neighborhoods. Within areas designated neighborhood conservation, neighborhood-specific zoning districts would be established that would describe prevailing lot sizes, permitted uses, and still allow for improvement and expansion of existing development. Looking at large child care facility standards, these are the standards required of the zoning code. So they have to meet off-street parking requirements of section 4-6-5. And we have a new ordinance which covers this that was passed by council about 3 weeks ago. And that new ordinance revised the off-street parking to just require 4 off-street parking spaces per facility, 2 loading zones provided, and they give you a couple of different options. On-street has to be approved by the city engineer when the space is reserved or otherwise available. Has to be located on the same side of the street as the daycare facility, and has to be at least 30 feet from any street intersection. Or the second option is off-street, where the travel path of the loading spaces to the facility entrance does not cross vehicular maneuvering and travel areas. So the applicant is proposing, so first we've got 4 off-street parking spaces proposed in this southeast corner. So they currently have an existing paved parking lot, which is developed to our standards, as well as some angled off-street parking here that uses Monroe Street as the travel aisle. This lot over here is currently gravel and wasn't used to satisfy any off-street parking requirement previously. Per our parking lot standards, if you have a parking lot that is 4 or less parking spaces, which this would be, technically you're not required to improve it. But I think it's going to be our recommendation that a time period be given to bring this into compliance, since it's not really one individual parking lot. It's pretty much used as a whole parking system between the parking on Monroe Street and the large parking lot here. It's really one large parking lot just divided into separate areas on the property, and so we would recommend that that be brought into compliance, and I think the time frame would specify it as 5 years, and so that would be a recommended condition. Here are the 2 on-street loading spaces that the engineering department has looked at and approved. Right now, there's loading spaces along the west side of Monroe Street that are utilized by St. Rose's when they had the daycare operation there. There's no parking on the east side of the street right now. So the proposal would be to swap that, and so you'd have the 2 loading zone spaces here on the east side. They designate this whole curb here on the west side as no parking. As you transition to the south, this would be on-street parking. As you can see, it currently exists. And so it would just be that section from essentially the intersection down to this curb approach here for the off-street parking on that property that would be designated as no parking. The facility entrance is proposed to be right here at this location. And so that was the preferred route and the closest route for children to be able to access that entrance, was the drop-off here along the street and then walking along the sidewalk directly to the entrance. And so that was another reason why St. Mary's looked at specifying those 2 as the loading zone locations. So continuing with our large child care facility standards, so it required to be a contained or fenced outdoor play area sufficient to comply with spatial standards required by state licensing. St. Mary's already has that large fenced playground which meets and exceeds the size requirements of the city code. And then there is a portion that, or a section of those standards that requires site-proof fencing or site-proof landscaping on perimeters of the play area where necessary to protect privacy in neighbors' yards. They do have an enclosure, so there's a 6-foot chain link fence that's actually a little bit larger at that northeast corner of D Street and Lincoln as a backstop, I would imagine. And so it really is surrounded on all sides by city streets and not necessarily backyards of neighbors that could happen in some other circumstances. So staff would recommend that no screening be required, since the playground is adjacent to only city streets and doesn't affect any neighboring yards. So this was the site plan that was submitted by St. Mary's. You can see this is the portion of the building that would be utilized for the large daycare. This is the floor plan of the building, so they have an existing classroom that would end up being taken over by the large child care facility, and this is that entrance here. And this is just an elevation. This is looking from D Street at the entrance, and then this is looking from Monroe Street, and it'd be the first floor under the stairwell here where the main entrance would be for that classroom. This is a Just a photo from Google Earth looking in the southeast direction. Would be the northwest corner of the building, so that would be the entrance to the daycare classroom. This is the main entrance to St. Mary's School here off of Monroe Street. You can see this would be the area that would be the loading zone, and then this would be the side of the street where you'd have no parking on that side. And this is a view looking southwest from D Street, so this is the intersection of Lincoln and D. You can see the backstop that's a little bit taller for the fence, and then they've got a 6-foot chain link fence that surround the playground, the play area, large grass area, and then there's some playground structures here in that area. So staff recommends approval of conditional use permit application for a large child care facility located at 412 North Monroe, with the only condition being the applicant be required to improve the proposed 4-space parking lot located in the southeast corner of the subject property to City of Moscow parking lot standards within 5 years of approval of the conditional use permit. And I'd certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Marshall?
Yeah, Mike, I guess I got a couple of them. When I looked at the aerial there, I didn't see any of the ADA compliant parking standards, so I assume that that would be addressed at some point.
Yeah, and they have, well, it's kind of covered by the daycare entrance thing. So they have 2 ADA compliant spaces here. And so per the facility, they have less than 50 spaces, so they'd only be required to provide 2 right now. If they went over 50, then there'd be a requirement to have, add an additional 1 to that. And so right now they're compliant even with the 4 additional.
Okay. And the next question I have, Mike, and I don't know if you can see it closely on here, the location of the dumpster, is that going to be problematic with loading and unloading kids? Because now that they're may move across the street.
And the current location of the dumpster is?
Yeah, it's right there, close to the loading.
Oh,
zone
right
there.
here.
Yeah.
I don't think it'd be problematic. I mean, usually the refuse collection and Father Joe would be able to speak to the times that they pick that up, but usually you would veer in and they'd pick it up with a front forklift style garbage truck and then unload, dump it and then reverse back out onto the street at an angle. So I wouldn't
guess they could
anticipate.
adjust those hours.
Yeah.
Congruent with the school hours.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
I have a question about the four new stalls. The city's recommending that area be improved, but it's not required, but you recommend it. Can you clarify why that is?
Well, it's not, yeah, it's so our code requires that 4 or fewer parking spaces not be improved. And the main idea behind that is that if you have, it's more geared towards single family and duplexes. So if you have a duplex dwelling, you're required to have 4 off-street parking spaces. To require parking lot standards for a duplex would be a little onerous. And so that's really why we draw the distinction at 4 spaces. It doesn't draw a distinction between commercial or multifamily or single family or 2-family. It's pretty much just the number of spaces is what kicks in our parking lot standards. So, this being more of a commercial institutional type use, and having the remainder of the parking is improved on Moreau, and then they have the large parking lot here. It functions more of, these 3, even though they're distinct separate areas, they function more as a whole to provide parking for the, St. Mary's School and the proposed child care facility as a whole. And so if we were to say if those were attached and contiguous in some manner to one of those other parking lots, then they'd be required to improve those. It just so happens that they're located on another area of the lot, and to say that those wouldn't need to be improved, we feel that they should, since it's part of their parking system and their requirement.
Part of that improvement means turning how much of that impervious or pervious area to impervious area?
Well, it's already gravel right now, and so we would say that it's currently impervious, even with the addition of asphalt. It wouldn't really change. It would just be paving it. There's already sidewalks that exist. The only difference here, there really wouldn't be a whole lot of other area that would need to be paved other than what you're seeing in the gravel area. There would be a requirement for a 3-foot landscape buffer in this small area right here that isn't the travel aisle for the access to the parking lot. And so essentially what you'd be seeing is just a rectangle that would be paved, and then you'd have a 3-foot landscape buffer right here on this portion of the fence, and that would be it. So it would essentially be the same area they have gravel right now. It would just be that they would need to pave it within 5 years and put in the small addition of landscaping in the southeast corner.
Marshall?
Yeah, Mike, is there on-street parking on Lincoln Street now, currently?
There is currently. They have some designation as bus parking, but speaking with the applicant, it sounds like there may be 10 buses per year that end up, showing up, so that's underutilized. I know that there is a portion of that that's designated as loading just for the bus loading, but we could probably look at the city if they're truly, indeed using that so infrequently, to take a look at putting some on-street parking back on it. But as you head to the south, this is pretty much on-street parking there on both sides.
And then, Mike, on Monroe Street, is that a two-way street?
It is, correct.
One way. So is the angled parking there a problem, or how do the cars maneuver? I mean, it looks like it's a narrow street there, and if I had my pickup, I'd have to make a 5-point turn to get in there.
Yeah, it's a narrow street, but it's just, it's more or less an existing condition that's been there. And so that's why they generally have one side of the street as no parking, because there wouldn't be enough room to have parking on one side and then the loading zones on the other. And so right now they've got this as, no parking. There is, no parking loading zone on this side of the street right now. And I think that, some people probably do utilize that for illegal parking at times, sometimes during the day. But as you head to the south, there's on-street parking as you head further down Monroe Street.
Mike, I had a question. You were talking about on the west side, there's currently no parking, and it sounds like on the east side is the proposed loading zone. Is it anticipated that would be no parking on both sides, at least at that point, or is?
Yeah, it'd be no parking on both sides, but there would be the 2 loading zones, so
Okay.
that would just be the temporary loading zone
Okay.
parking. But yeah, we would have to, right now, the west side says no parking loading zone, and so we'd essentially swap those signs out and put them on the east side, and then put the no parking signs that currently exist on the east side on the west side. So we would just be switching the existing, pretty much the same situation that we have going on, just reversing the sides of the street. And then the direction of the loading. Right now, the loading on the west side, they approach from the north and unload, and it would be reversed on the other side. So they'd approach from the south and unload on the east side of the street.
Any other questions for staff? Thanks, Mike. With that presentation from the city, I now open it up for the applicant to come up and speak to us. If you so choose. You don't have to.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah. And need to state your name and address
Okay.
into the mic for the record.
My name is Father Joe McDonald, and my address is 618 East 1st Street. I'm the pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church and the superintendent of St. Mary's Catholic School. I want to thank Mike Ray and the city for helping us devise this plan. We're anxious to be able to serve the city, continue to serve the city with the 3- and 4-year-olds. It's a wonderful program that we have, and it's been going on for decades and decades, and we'd like to continue that tradition by moving St. Rose's over to St. Mary's. And so Thank you again, Mike, for all your help in making this happen. Thanks.
So I have one question.
Yes.
Just I want to clear.
Sure.
My understanding then, Father, is that really the only thing logistically that's going to change from your perspective is unloading is going to happen on the other side of the street.
That is correct. It will happen on the St. Mary's School side of the street.
Rather than Okay.
people coming down from St. Rose's, because right now, currently, that's a yellow. No parking, loading,
Okay,
and so it'll just be the opposite.
okay. That's what I thought the case would be, and it's going to be about a 15-foot difference,
Yeah,
so.
I think it'll
Thank you.
work out much better, yes.
I had a question, and it just says that right now, the anticipation for the preschool for this coming enrollment is 28. And can you give me some idea what your highs and lows are for that over the course of time? I mean, the 28, is that a pretty standard number, or is that a low number of 3 to 4-year-olds?
That number is based on the number of students that we had this year, which we anticipate coming over. Some of those will not be associated with St. Rose's. They might move up to kindergarten, which would then they would be a part of the elementary school. The number, Sister Margaret Johnson is here, and she is the former director of St. Rose's, and she could answer that question whether that's a high or a low, or an average, if you needed that number.
Okay,
That's an average.
average number?
Yeah.
Okay.
And one other question, in terms of paving that parking space on the east side, do you anticipate that's going to be a problem within the next 5 years? If that's imposed as a condition, is that going to create an undue hardship on you?
I don't think so. I think four spaces is reasonable, and I appreciate that there was a change in that, because it's very clear now, and we know that those spaces can be dedicated. I don't think within the next 5 years there will be a problem in order to just make that a more permanent, up to, Mike had mentioned to me what type of parking lot it becomes. So I'm not familiar with, the exact names of what it's called, but he did explain to me that it would have to be upgraded to meet city standards.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anybody else care to come up and speak in favor of this conditional use application? Step on up and state your name and address into the mic, please.
I'm Keith Stormo, and I've lived for 25 years kitty corner from the backstop on 904 East D Street. They have been a wonderful neighbor for 25 years, and I'm very frustrated I didn't come here 10 years ago when they were trying to get their conditional approval for their original design. There were people from long distances away that came and argued that they have to change their roof design. And now they've had leaks that have been there because they had to shorten the roof by 3 or 4 feet. And I didn't want that to happen again. It's good to see there aren't a bunch of people hopefully opposed to it. So I just wanted to come and voice my concern because they have been an excellent neighbor. If you look at the street address of St. Rose's, it's actually listed as Howard Street. And that's like listing your back door as your street address. St. Rose's is, in the 25 years, I don't think I've ever seen somebody come in that door from the street. They've always entered from Howard Street, and that's been where people go into either St. Mary's or St. Rose's. They have a very good traffic flow. I drive by there at least twice a day, and the car traffic and things are always working very nicely. So I strongly hope that you will realize they are a good group to be in that position, whether it be St. Rose's on the west side of the street or on the east side of the street. If they have people between 1 and 2 on one side. I mean, they just have a very good job of keeping track of children, going wherever they belong, and having a safe road there. I think part of the issue that concerns me, and it's usual, I've never seen the big parking lot they have full, except a few times when they have like a parents' night or, some kind of open house or something like that. Usually that's a playground, and very few, if any cars there parked. So to me, that 4 parking space on the east side, I would argue should not have a conditional use permit required to pave it in 5 years. I think that's unnecessary, and if they feel a need to pave it, they can, but I don't think it should be conditioned for their permit. They do anything that's necessary to make it good, and if they felt it was good to be paved, they would do that, but I don't see any reason that they should be required to pave it in 5 years. I just wanted to come here and make sure that there wasn't people who were going to argue that it should not be granted. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else care to come up and speak in favor of this application? Don't be shy. It's not a big crowd. We've got all night. Well, if no one else wants to speak in favor, is there anybody that wants to speak against it or as a neutral party? Seeing none, I guess we will close this public hearing and deliberate on the board. Who wants to start? Marshall?
Well, I think that the facility meets the criteria for, the daycare. I think that it's a good location, and I think I don't have any problems with granting the conditional use permit. In regards to paving of the parking lot, I strongly feel that we should treat all people the same, no matter whether it's a religious facility or a duplex, and I think the city does a real good job with that. If there was a private entity coming in here, they would be required to do the same thing. Isn't that correct, Mike, as far as the parking lot goes? So I strongly feel we should treat every applicant the same as far as that goes. So I'm definitely in favor of granting the conditional use permit, and unless somebody wants to speak forward ahead of me, I'll make a motion on that.
I think their track record clearly stands for itself over the past several years from the very beginning, how they deal with traffic, how they deal with kids, how the facility interacts with the surrounding neighborhoods. I think the conditional use itself it's clearly a slam dunk. It complies with all 7 criteria that we have to deal with. The only real thing that we're talking about here is paving 4 spaces. The only reason I asked Mike the questions is it seems anti-green and non-sustainable to pave something that doesn't need to be. But I appreciate exactly what you're saying too. If someone else had to pave it, they would. It just seems odd in that spot if it's not required to actually make it a hard service. But in terms of the conditional use itself, this just seems like one of the easiest ones we have.
I agree. We rarely see them come through so clear-cut as this. And I think it's significant to point out that really the practical difference in this particular case is the loading is going to take place on the east side of the street instead of the west side of the street. And that's such a narrow street, it's about a 15-foot difference. It's going to be absolutely invisible. I think we've got testimony from a neighbor that says there's no problems right now. I don't expect there to be any problems. I've been in the school facility before, and it works. And so I agree with Marshall. I agree with you. This is an easy call for me. So,
Thoughts at this end?
Yeah, well, my thought is that as It's indicated here that there isn't much opposition to the proposal, and really all they're asking for is to move the daycare from one side of the street to the other, and they're adequately arranging for the parking to take place as it needs to be. So I have no problems at all with the application. The only issue, like Joe was mentioning, was whether or not to require the parking to be, the parking lot to be paved or not. And I'm torn with what Marshall's thoughts are. I think that's probably justified, and at the same time, it's an area that isn't it isn't tied into the other parking area on the west side of the building. So it doesn't give them any paving. It doesn't give them any more parking, and it doesn't deal any better or worse with the runoff of the water that would be coming off the roof or onto the street. So I'm kind of torn on that aspect of it, but we need to kick that around maybe. But
Joe, can I ask Mike a quick question?
Sure.
Mike, when the city suggests paving the parking lot and bringing it up to standards, would they have to do a collection system of the water or tie into a storm sewer? How, when we say the improvement of the parking lot, what all is required with that?
Well, detention is only required when there's more than 5,000 square feet of impervious surface, so this, would not meet 5,000 square feet. And so they would need to do some type of stormwater management, but it wouldn't have to be detention. So they don't need to have catch basins, or anything like that installed and piped to the storm system. They could handle that with swales or some other means to convey the stormwater. But yeah, it would just be, strictly, they already have the sidewalk there, so that's fine. And they could pave just right over the gravel, right up to the sidewalk. Wheel stops, regardless, would be required, just because you can't, right now with a gravel lot, you can't stripe it or else that'll disappear within a week. So the only way to delineate parking spaces in gravel is to put wheel stops in front of them. So they'll need to do that, upon initiation of the use and the parking lot. So really, we're just talking about paving and a small portion of curbing and landscaping in that southeast corner that looks to be, those spaces are 9 feet wide. So we're looking at probably around 10 feet of curbing and landscaping in that southeast corner. And the other reason, we usually recommend paving for these larger institutional, commercial, or multifamily uses is that they usually get a lot more use, and you end up with, when you have the gravel, there's a lot more like noise, dust, vibrations of cars going over the gravel that could disturb a residential neighborhood. Now, I don't know how much they plan to utilize these spaces or not, and so you might not get that. But usually that's the biggest concern, is when you have a larger parking lot and it's gravel, that continuous cars driving over that creates dust if they don't, apply some type of treatment to it. And the vibrations of, whenever you hear a car going up a residential alley, you can definitely hear it coming. And so that's kind of just the nuisance issue that, we usually look at when you have these institutional uses that are surrounded by residential neighborhoods. And so that's part of it. But yeah, they wouldn't be required to detain it just because it's not above the 5,000 square foot threshold. So.
Thanks, Mike.
Rain, thoughts?
Oh, just, as I've heard other people say, this is probably one of the simplest, least controversial proposals that we've had. I also live in the neighborhood where I live on Hayes and D, so I walk through the neighborhood a lot, and I guess, I share the question, especially since the school is operating at well under the capacity of the building, both in terms of students and in staff, why this many additional parking spaces are needed at all, and whether parking might be a question to be deferred into the future when the demand arises.
Marshall?
Well, Joe, I'd make the motion that we approve the conditional use permit with the one condition that the parking lot on the east side be improved to the city standards within 5 years.
Okay. I have a motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
I have a motion. I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. That is unanimous. It is approved, and with the condition that the city recommended. And
As far as the relevant criteria, I think there was some relevant criteria provided by the applicant, and I looked it over, and it seemed very good and reasonable to me. And I'd make the motion that we accept the criteria that was given to us. I don't know if there's a page number on that, but that is in our packet.
I would second that.
I thought it was these.
It's on the back right here.
Oh, you're talking about pages 3 and 4,
Yeah.
not 1 and 2?
They're not. That's right.
Okay.
It's .7 on the application.
Oh, gotcha. All right. So I have a motion. Did I hear a second?
You did.
I have a motion. I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 That is unanimous again. Since we adopted these, Marshall, will you read them
Sure.
out loud so that it's part of the record?
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Do we need to do that?
Well, we typically staff usually drafts those, and we typically come back and
Right.
just approve them at a short meeting.
Do you-
I can certainly, because we don't have the full findings, there are the criteria, but that's half of it. We have like the
Right.
findings of fact
Oh,
at the beginning.
okay.
So I can, based upon that motion, I could craft the criteria based upon what the applicant
And
submitted.
add the findings to it?
And then add findings
Okay.
to it, and then we could bring it back if you would so direct me to do that.
Now, do I need to restate my motion, withdraw it and restate it?
No, because the motion was to approve the relevant criteria. I just was
And direct-
requesting that
and
you read
direct
it
staff-
aloud, and we don't need to do
Okay.
that yet.
And direct staff to bring us the relevant criteria with findings at a meeting where we can look at that time.
So let's do that. Do you want us to actually formally move?
Yeah, let's just vote on that,
All right.
the next bit there.
All in favor of allow, well,
I'll
there's-
second that
there's
as
a
well.
First, there's a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Staff, you have been directed to put the relevant criteria that we have approved, along with the findings for a future meeting for us to approve minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
When do we want to have our future meeting?
How much time does staff need to prepare this?
Well, we need at least 48 hours notice on the meeting, so I'm sure you don't want to show up on Friday for that. But how about next Tuesday? We do that?
Okay. Right after work, say 5:15,
That work, Ann?
I can get here.
5:30?
5:30 works a little easier to get over
All
over
right.
here.
Look like I'm clear.
That works for me.
Okay.
That work for you, Steve?
Yes.
5:30 on Tuesday?
5:30 Tuesday.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Next order of business. Any board communications?
Well, the only thing I have is just to introduce a new staff member in the planner
been awfully
position
quiet.
is Leah Carlson.
Hello.
And she comes to us from Pullman, actually, where she lives right now, but she ended up, I think, going to school for urban planning in Western Washington. So she was over on the west side for quite a while, so
No.
we're happy to have her here.
Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to meet all of you.
Okay.
Are there any forthcoming meetings that we should be aware of?
There is I think, a conditional use permit on the horizon, but it hasn't been submitted yet. So we're probably, over the next month, we'll probably have another meeting, so. Can't tell you the date, though.
At this point, it would be at least the end of July, maybe
Yeah,
August.
It would be, yep.
Okay.
Around that time frame.
All right.
All right.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I'll second that one too.
All in favor? Aye. It is unanimous. Thank you.